I want to welcome you guys. I want to welcome Steve Rosen to the Rock and Roll True Stories channel. And just he's got a really interesting book about Eddie Van Halen and his 26-year relationship with him. And basically, Steve, I know we chatted before, but I mean, you've been a music journalist for a long time, like spanning like 4 or 5 decades. I mean, you've written for like so many magazines all around the world. You've toured with countless bands. I mean, some of the lists we were talking about before, I mean, you toured with Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, the list goes on. And then you became personal friends with Eddie Van Halen, wrote a book about it called Tonechaser, Understanding Edward, My 26-Year Journey with Edward Van Halen. And that's what we're here to talk about. So I want to welcome you to the show.
Thanks so much, Sid. Nice to be here, buddy.
So for the audience, like, I guess, I went through some of the book, and I guess to summarize for them, you talk about being friends with Eddie Van Halen for 26 years. You spent a lot of time together. You interviewed him. Some of the interviews were never published, but I guess they've surfaced as part of the book. You hung out a lot. You even jammed with him, which is crazy. I mean, that would be like any fan's dream. And then you have some stories about going on a double date with him. I wanted to see if is that a good summary of the book for those who are watching. And then you talk about the inner workings of the band too during your time with them as well.
Yeah. No, man, that's probably pretty concise. And actually, to put a point on it, I actually double dated with Alex.
Oh, it was with Alex Van Halen's brother. Okay.
I wanted to double date with Edward. Ed, let's go on a double date, dude. But yeah, it was Alex, which was an amazing night as well.
Yeah, like I guess that leads me to one of my other questions later on. But you talk about I've seen some of your other interviews in which you've written that you're a guitar player yourself. You were a huge fan of Jeff Beck, Jimi Hendrix, Eric Clapton, and Ritchie Blackmore. And fast forward to 1977, it's the summer of '77, and you meet Eddie Van Halen for the first time. Months before their first record came out. Right. Like, had you seen the band play yet, or getting any kind of inkling of what their sound was like before you had met them for the first time?
That was one of the key things I was trying to recall when I started the book. I realized, that's an important point. And no, I never saw Van Halen live before speaking with him. Certainly I'd heard of him. I'd heard of Van Halen. They were, by '77, they were sort of darlings of the strip. But, the record wouldn't be out, like you said, for 6 months. So I really had no idea, what kind of music they played. I mean, I was assuming if they were a strip band, it was going to be, some kind of a hard rock, melodic hard rock kind of a sound. But I had no idea of how this guy, Edward Van Halen, played or anything like that.
So when you meet him for the first time, I imagine it's like through the record label or through management. Like, how would they? I guess my question was, like, how did they sell the band to you as a journalist when you meet him for the first time? Like, I'm assuming they didn't say these guys are going to change rock and roll and he's going to become one of the greatest guitar players, for the '80s and so on.
Yeah, right. Actually, for me, it was a little bit different. So I meet Ed in '77. At the end of our conversation at the whiskey, he gives me his phone number. He says, "Hey, man, call me." It's like, okay, I just met you. I don't know you, but you give me your phone number. I'll call you. I interview him for the first time, proper interview on the phone, December of '77. So the first record still hasn't come out. And we're just talking about guitar playing, this kind of stuff. The record comes out, is that February of '78, that first record?
Yeah, it's February of '78.
Right. And again, I famously write about hearing that record for the first time. I didn't think it was that good. I didn't. It's like, I don't get it, man. Machine Head, In Rock by Purple blows this stuff away. I just got this sort of Purple, hyper kind of boogie shuffle band, and I thought, I don't get it, But then I realized, hey, look, man, I've got to be missing something if every other writer in the world and every other fan says, these guys are unbelievable. the next day I sat down and listened to everything more closely, and I realized that, oh my God, this is that Edward Van Halen guy. This guy is, gonna rewrite the history of a rock guitar, which he did. So in answer to your question, I never really went through the labels to interview him. By that time, I would just sort of call him at home and say, Ed,
Right.
we need to do an interview. So honestly, I don't know how he was presented by the label. I mean, Ed would tell me that the labels, that Warner Brothers really didn't have real high expectations for them, that they weren't given like a priority, So I'm sure that kind of stuck with Ed. And after they started, selling records, and after that first tour, and now they're headlining their own tours, I'm sure Warner's rethought that and go, oh my God, this, we've got something here. Let's focus our efforts on them.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I know that you also say that, I think it was Van Halen's fourth. He considered Van Halen's fourth record to really be their first record, or like their really the beginning.
The 1984 record.
Yeah, no, thinking record. Am I thinking?
Warning.
Fair Warning. Yeah, Fair Warning. That's
Warning.
What it was. Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think that was a monster record, because it's the first time we heard Ed able to take all the time he wanted to write guitar parts. It's the first time we hear Edward and how his brain worked as an orchestrator, and his harmonic approach and layering guitars in the beautiful way he, work in some little guitar line, and his rhythm playing was so much more, it was more complex. Again, there were more parts. I think that was a huge step. I looked at 1984. I think that's sort of analogous to Supertramp's Crime of the Century. Supertramp made these amazing records, but Crime of the Century, all of a sudden the sound of their records and the writing was elevated. A more famous record, Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon, right? I mean, Pink Floyd made amazing records, but Dark Side was like, a lot of people look at that record as a springboard, Yeah, so I mean, I thought those records were pivotal. I thought they elevated Edward, his playing, his writing to the next level for sure.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about the beginning of the interview, going a double date with Alex Van Halen. Like, you talk about your 26-year friendship with him. So you got close with the other members of Van Halen too, like other than Eddie?
I mean, that's a great question. So Alex, I mean, I ran into fairly often up at Ed's, when he was living in Coldwater with Valerie and, 5150 studio. Alex basically lived literally 5 minutes away down Mulholland. So he was very close. So I think he was spending a lot of time with Ed. So a lot of times when I was over at 5150, Alex would be there. And we got along great, man. I think Alex recognized in me someone who cared about his brother. I might have been a journalist, but I think Alex knew I wasn't going to, misrepresent Edward or write stuff about him that wasn't true. And I think he sensed it early on, so he sort of welcomed me. Michael, I had met several times. I interviewed him for the book. Just to backtrack real quickly, in 1985, I was supposed to write Edward's authorized biography.
Yeah, that was going to be one of my questions. Like, you guys had a contract that you were going to write his autobiography.
We had two contracts. The first one was in 84. I literally typed up one paragraph saying, I, Steve Rosen, have the sole rights to write Edward's authorized biography. And I signed it and he signed it. Then about a year later, he had his lawyer draft up a little more thorough contract. And even then, it was only 2 or 3 paragraphs, basically stating the same thing. That publication of the book is in the sole is at the sole discretion of Edward Van Halen, which meant I couldn't go out and write a book and, release it on my own. That Ed had to have the okay, which of course would have gone without saying. So yeah, so we wrote, we signed contracts. I did a lot of interviews with people surrounding Ed, his friends and guys who were promoting, the shows in Pasadena, engineers, a lot of key people in the band's development. And at a point in time, I kept coming back to Ed. Ed, come on, man, let's sit down. I need to do more interviews with you. I want to know about your family and, what was it like when you were a little 8-year-old Eddie Van Halen? What kind of a kid were you? And he just would always say, hey, listen, now's not the right time. There's going to be another record coming out. And if we do the book now, that means the record won't be part of the book and people are going to think my career is going to be over. And I thought when he would say that, it was just the most remarkable thing. Here's the most important guitar player in the world, arguably at that time. And he's worried that if a book came out at X period, that somehow people were going to see that as the end of Van Halen or the end of his creativity. And that just goes to his humility and really not having, and I don't think he ever did, a true grasp of his own legacy or his own influence. He knew he was a very good guitar player, but I don't think he had a real understanding of how important he was in the, history of guitar playing. To get back to your point, Sid, so Michael, I kind of knew and did a fair amount of interviews with him for the book. Also interviewed Alex for the book. And Dave, I ran into a couple times, I think probably like at a show. He was always very nice. He knew I was friends with Edward. I interviewed him one time and he was Dave, very bright guy, a little over the top, but very nice, yeah. But he was integral to the success of that band. He was everything Edward wasn't, which was just loud, in a good way, outsized ego, a guy fronting the band, not afraid to do or say anything. And Edward was not that person, man. Edward was a musician, and he recognized, he needed this other piece. Along the way, there was friction, and I write a lot about that in the book. But at the end of the day, and I want to make this point, Edward loved Michael and Dave. I think Edward would have wanted nothing more than that band to have remained, as that original 4-piece. We all know that didn't happen, but I think Edward would have wanted more than anything for that to have happened. So, so I knew the other guys, not real well, but we were all very friendly, and it was always, very cordial when I was around them.
So you mentioned about writing the book around the time of, you talked about an album coming out. Was that the first album with Sammy Hagar?
Yeah, it was actually right after that. And in fact, Edward said at one point, and I write about this because when he brought this up, I was floored. With Ed, as much as there was a part of him that really wanted to do the book, there was a part of him that I believe didn't see the importance of the book. It's not that he didn't want to do it. He just didn't understand what a book meant as part of his legacy or history. Certainly he didn't need me writing a book about him to legitimize what he had brought to electric guitar.
Right.
But man, with him, first, last, and everything else, it was music and it was playing guitar. Even sometimes to the point of his family would come second. So he loved Valerie, and obviously when Wolf was born, he loved him and he loved his brother. But man, that's all he ever did. Honestly, he never was without a guitar in his hand. He was always playing. That's what he did. So I'm talking to Edward about the book during one of our conversations, and it's like, Ed, come on, man, let's sit down. Let me do some interviews, for the book, And he said, well, man, now it's not the right time. And then he said, hey, you know what? And this is after 5150 came out. He goes, what if we do the book in two parts? And he said, what if we do, part one could be, the first album through 5150, so we can, include, Sammy. And then part two will be whenever it comes, the next albums with Sammy or whatever happens. And I said, Edward, that's brilliant. That's fantastic. In my mind, of course, I wanted to do a book too, but I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking, oh my God, if that's how we can sit down and do book one, then yeah, man, I'm on board. And so he would mention that, and then the next day, it's as if it never happened. Or if I brought it up, it's as if he never remembered. And what he wasn't trying to be evasive. It just, man, he had so much other stuff going on.
So much other stuff on his mind. Yeah.
Yeah, man. It just got pushed down, and I had to live with that. And I realized I wasn't a priority with him, nor should I have been. But, I worked for many years on that first book, and at a point in time, I really had to let go of it, because it was making me a little crazy and trying to, chase after him and wanting so badly for it to come out, because I thought it would have been a really important book at that time. And I had to kind of let it go. And that was a hard thing to do. So then to pick the book up 17 years after I last spoke with him, that was a really difficult thing to do. But I'm glad I did it,
Did you ever speak with Sammy?
I never spoke with Sammy about the book specifically. I'd actually interviewed Sammy. I think it was about 2 months before he joined Van Halen. There's no discussion of Van Halen because it hadn't been brought up yet.
Right.
So it was still his solo career. And I thought Sammy was really great, man. He was, the interview was really cool. But no, I never spoke to Sammy sort of after he joined Van Halen. Ran into him once or twice, and he kind of remembered, me from, pre-Van Halen days. But no, we never really had any conversations. I know that thing between Ed and Sammy, which started really on a positive foot. Ed was really psyched about that. He was really happy about that. I write about that. Had its road bumps, and ultimately we all know that kind of fell apart for various reasons. And I'm certain the truth is somewhere in between what Sammy said and what Ed said.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah. So Ed expected a lot from the people around him, and a part of me understands it. On the other side of that, no one was going to devote as much time as Edward was to the music, because Ed lived for it, So when those things kind of came up and some of the other musicians, Ed felt not angry, and though it manifested itself in anger, I think it was more he felt disrespected. I think, hey, man, this is the music, and it's our music, and why aren't you working as hard as I am? So I think that's where a lot of those feelings came from.
Yeah, and did you feel like as a journalist, having covered so many bands, do you think the '80s was like the last great decade of rock, or do you feel like there was lots of great stuff to come in the '90s?
Man, I love that question. I mean, I'm really going to anger a lot of people. I thought the '60s were the last great decade for the Carpenters. My brother and I have a joke. Nothing after August 1969 is any good. We're being a little petty about that. I mean, for me, yes, I believe that's true. And a lot of the guys who sort of, transitioned in the 80s began in the 70s, Van Halen.
Yeah.
Jeff Beck who made the greatest instrumental record of all time, Blow by Blow, but obviously Jeff goes back to the 60s, and those records with Rod Stewart, which I thought were some of the most remarkable records ever made. Cream with Clapton, amazing. You know, Robin Trower with Procol Harum. Yeah, man. I mean, look, there's some very good guitar players who came later in the '80s, you know, and you know, the Steve Vai School and Joe Satriani. Um, uh, you know, I mean, Warren DeMartini, you know, George Lynch. I mean, these are remarkable guitar players. But I guess, you know, for me, uh, a guitar player could have been amazing, but in the context of the music, it was a little hard for me to listen to. So if I wasn't really listening to the band, you know, I would more appreciate the guitar player than I would say, wow, God, man, I love that guitar player. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, you know, I hate to be a snob about it, but, you know, I held the bar very high. So you had to be as good as Jeff Beck or Jimi Hendrix or Clapton or Jimmy Page or Trower or Paul Kossoff, you know, for me to kind of want to reach out and listen to you kind of thing. So, you know, right or wrong, that's who I was, you know, and kind of remain to this day. So,
Yeah, I feel the same way about the rock music for the last 20 years or so anyways.
yeah, you know, it's a different world. Look, you know, the internet has been an unbelievable blessing for a lot of musicians, right? They can now get their music out there. You know, they can put up a website, they can record a record for, you know, the price of a you know, software program and a drum machine. That's great. On the other side of that, every single person who now has ever held a guitar fancies himself a guitar player and a songwriter,
Right.
and something to contribute to the world of music, you know. And you know, that clogs up a lot of those creative arteries, you know, where maybe there are some great musicians out there who will never be heard because you just, you know, they don't know how to reach you and you don't know how to reach them. So, yeah, it's just a different world. You know, I grew up, and maybe you did, Sid, I don't think you're that old, but, you know, vinyl, man, you know, record came out, it was special and important. And, you know, you kept that record and you listened to every song on it, you know. Then we transitioned to CDs and now it's streaming.
Yeah, I hate the whole thing. 'Cause, I mean, I grew up in the era of CDs and cassette tapes, and I mean, even before social media, all you had was just the album artwork and whatever you read in the magazines. And now every rock star has like a social media page, and it takes some of that mystery away.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. And plus you're listening to this music as a stream, not meant to be listened to that way. Even on the best, you know, earbuds, headphones, you know,
yeah,
it doesn't matter, man. You're supposed to listen to a CD, music the way it was recorded. It was recorded analog, and this is how it's supposed to be listened. But
yeah,
you
it's
know,
even imperfect. Like I was listening to, because I mean, it took me a long time to get used to streaming, but I mean, I was listening to YouTube Music, and it's recommending stuff that, you know, maybe I would like. And it's funny, it was recommending me AC/DC covers. Like, I like AC/DC, but like, really, it doesn't have the intelligence to like, no, don't recommend me covers. I'd rather hear the band perform it themselves or something in
yeah,
the vein of that. But it's
exactly.
still imperfect. And now with AI, it's a whole other story. And you know,
Yeah, man, remains to be seen what happens with that. That's pretty weird. Paul McCartney wrote a song AI. I mean, my God, you know. So we'll see.
yeah, it feels like the whole human element is just going away, and it's not real anymore. I mean, it's a shame, but I guess it kind of brings me to my last question is, you know, we talked a little bit about music and about the which decade, you know, was the last great decade. I wanted to ask you about music journalism. Like, what is it like today? It feels like everything is so fragmented, and it's not what it used to be. Especially now, like I hear so many places that were basically institutions of rock, or even whether it's magazines or channels or shows, like they're not around anymore.
That's an excellent question, Sid. You know, I've often thought about that. You know, some kid coming out of, you know, college or journal, you know, 4 years of journalism, you know, and he wants to be a music journalist. You know, he wants to write about music that he loves. How does he do that and make a living at it? And man, I am hard pressed to give you an answer. I mean, you know, I didn't grow up. I started writing in the early 70s when rock and roll magazines were really just being birthed. You know, Guitar Player had only been out for a couple of years. Um, Guitar World had been around. You know, Cream and Circus was just beginning. Rolling Stone, of course, had been around.
Yeah.
Crawdaddy, a few others, man. But all those, that's how you found your information. That's how you found out about bands. You read those interviews in magazines, and they were important. And you know, I did it as sort of a stepladder thing. I started writing for this sleazy sort of a softcore poor newspaper called the L.A. Star. You know, which you'd read because you turn to the back page and look for the massage ads. You know,
Right.
they had a tiny little music editorial. You know, half a page, and I sent some live reviews and album reviews, and they printed them, and I got something printed in the Los Angeles Free Press, which is like an underground newspaper, really hip, you know, and that was a springboard to Circus and Cream, and you know, I was sending out letters, you know. You couldn't even call because there was like no phone number. So you send out a letter, you'd find a name and hopefully an address. And hi, my name is Steve Rosen, you know, and I love to write for Cream magazine. And can I interview Deep Purple? I mean, you know, stupid things, and you'd be rejected, and then you know you get something printed. You know, so it grew like that. Now, I mean, you know, there's still some magazines around. I don't know how many of them use freelancers. Budgets have shrunk. So most of those stories are being done by staff editorial guys. You know, I mean, there's still some excellent magazines around, but I mean, they're really difficult to get into. You know, Mojo and Classic Rock. I mean, these are amazing magazines, amazing writers, Guitar World, Guitar Player. But again, most of that stuff is in-house. They've got a cadre of journalists they're using. Man, I hate to be the voice of doom, but it would just be a difficult thing. I sort of semi-retired really from writing about 4 years ago, probably right before I started working on the book. But prior to that, you know, I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to reach out to some music websites. I reached out, and by that time, I've been writing for 45 years, okay?
Right.
I reached out to hundreds of them. Each one, you know, hi, man, Steve Rosen, I've been writing, and I've done this, and, man, I'd love to write some interviews, you know. But, well, you know, we're not going to pay you, but we'll give you a byline, you know? And it's like, okay, well, I appreciate that, you know. And I finally found a couple of sites that paid, not very much money. But by then, I really wasn't looking for the money. I mean, look, money's important. I was just kind of looking, you know, as an outlet to do some things. But I think maybe that may have even dried up. So I wish I had an answer, man. I think maybe like anything else, it's creating something on your own or finding this voice of what you do that nobody else does and pitching over and over to these people at magazines and really believing in what you do and, you know, going out and landing, you know, some rare interview with, I don't know, man, Bruce Springsteen and, you know, pitching it. But that's a tough one, man. Unfortunately, that's a really tough one.
Yeah, it's unfortunate, but that brings us to the end of our time. But for those watching, like, where can people go get your book, Tonechaser?
Well, cool. You can find it on my website at tonechaserbook.com. One word, tonechaserbook.com. You can also find it on Amazon, eBay, Reverb, and Etsy, if anybody checks out Etsy.
Yeah, and you know what? The reviews, like, I went through the book in preparation for the interview, and the reviews speak for themselves. Like, I mean, people seem to really love it, and you know, whether you're a Van Halen fan or not, but yeah, it's fascinating read.
Well, I'm sorry, Sid. Well, thanks so much, man. Yeah, the reviews on Amazon have been fantastic. Every person who's written to me has liked it. I think one person was angry about who's that Steve Rosen and how can he write a book? Hey, fair enough,
You know what?
Um,
And no matter, you know what, everybody gets to hate, no matter like how good of a job you do and
exactly.
how, whatever you give to people. It's unfortunate. That's the world we live in,
That's the way
but
it goes.
that's the way it goes, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, man. Well, listen, Sid, thank you so much, dude. I apologize to you and everybody listening for being late. I'm never late. I cringe when I think about it because if somebody was late with me, I'd be screaming bloody murder. Where's that Sid? Anyway, man, sorry about the language. I apologize. This has been great, and I really thank you. Thank you for having me, buddy.
Thanks so much, Steve. Appreciate it.
Yeah.